Welcome to Sanctuary. Today's lesson is on the power of words, and we'll be speaking about the language of life and death. This is lesson 6, the language of life and death. So life is a language, just like death is a language. God speaks the language of life. Satan speaks the language of death. So I want to compare the two different languages for you. And I'm going to go through them quite quickly. So the language of life is to encourage and build up. The language of death is to hold back and tear down. The language of life is to have faith and to believe in God. The language of death is to doubt and believe in yourself. The language of life is love. Language of death is fear. Language of life is hope. The language of death is anxiety. The language of life is peace. The language of death is stress. The language of life is joy. The language of death is depression. The language of life is dreams and vision. The language of death is disappointment and reality. The language of life is confidence. The language of death is insecurity. The language of life is honor and innocence. The language of death is shame and guilt. And this is a big one, and we're going to get into this in a later lesson. The language of life is to serve and to support. The language of death is to compete and compare. So the language of life produces good. The language of death produces evil. And you remember in the previous lesson we got through talking about why there's so much evil on the earth is because people are choosing to speak death, evil words. So am I telling you that it's possible to stop speaking evil words? Absolutely. We need to learn a different language. In fact, you and I are created to speak the language of life. So where are we learning the language of death? Remember, we got through speaking about this in the previous lesson. Television, magazines, books, social media, Facebook, Instagram. We're learning the language of the world. From the internet, from parents, family, other children, friends, students, teachers, at work colleagues, from a boss. And you might say to me, but that's everywhere. Exactly. The language of the world, the language of death is everywhere. This is the world's system. So where do we learn the language of life? Well, God, remember we got through in previous lessons talking about the Bible. The language of life comes from God, and His language is found in the Bible. The Bible is where we learn the language of life, and where we can learn if we are speaking the language of evil or the language of death. So when we know the difference, and we see what the language of life is, then we can also know that we've been speaking words that are not life. So many people don't even know they are speaking death. And a very simple example of learning God's language is like learning mathematics. Mathematics is a language, the language of mathematics. So where do you start with maths? Well, you first have to know what numbers are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then you learn addition, 1 plus 1 equals 2. 4 plus 4 equals 8. Then you start to learn subtraction. 5 minus 3 equals 2. Then you learn multiplication. 2 times 2 equals 4. Then you learn division. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So that is the language of maths. Then you start to go into more advanced things. You start learning trigonometry and geometry and long division, and you learn a lot more complicated, complex thing in mathematics. That is the language. But you will never know trigonometry or geometry if you don't understand 1 plus 1. In fact, you won't know 5 times 5 if you don't understand the basics of maths. So that's how it is in learning the language of life. Most people are asking questions like, how can God be so good, but there's all this evil in the earth? They're asking questions like that, and yet they don't understand 1 plus 1. They don't know the basics of God's language. And so because people don't know God's language, and they ask questions like that, like, why is there so much evil on the earth? Then they listen to what everybody else is saying. And most people don't know God's language. Remember, we got through saying earlier that the language of death is everywhere. It's in the world system. So it's my responsibility and your responsibility to learn the language of life so that we can have answers to people when they ask these kinds of questions. Otherwise, most people just go with what everybody else is saying. And most people are saying, well, God can't be a good God because he lets all these evil things happen on the earth. Well, most people, they don't understand the language of God. And we're going to get into that in later lessons. Our next lesson, we're going to talk about following likes in a culture where we post things and then we get likes. And we also like things and we post those things. So we're going to get into that in the next lesson. Thank you for joining me on Sanctuary.